The gravel crunched under my tires, a sound like dry bones scattering, as I turned off the main road. The trees, ancient and gnarled, formed a tunnel that clawed at the fading afternoon light, their branches interwoven like arthritic fingers. Each gust of wind through them sounded like a sigh, long and mournful. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white, a familiar tension settling in my shoulders. This was it. The manor. My life, until this point, had been a careful study in precision. I restored what others considered lost, breathed life back into forgotten relics. A chipped porcelain figurine, a water-damaged mahogany desk, a faded tapestry, these were my companions, my silent confidants. I understood their histories, their flaws, their potential. They were predictable, tangible. People, on the other hand, with their shifting moods and unspoken expectations, always felt unwieldy. My meticulous nature, my quiet dedication to the forgotten, had always suited a solitary existence. But this inheritance, this sprawling, decaying edifice, was an entirely different beast. The solicitor had called it a magnificent opportunity. I'd seen the pictures. They lied, or at least, they were taken through a filter of desperate optimism. The driveway opened onto a vast, neglected expanse of what might once have been a lawn. Now, it was a tangled wilderness, thorny bushes wrestling with knee-high weeds. And then, the house. It didn't just stand, it loomed. A hulking silhouette against the bruised sky, its slate roof a jagged line of broken teeth, chimneys like dark, accusing fingers. The windows, countless and unblinking, stared out with a vacant, shattered gaze. Patches of ivy, thick as a man's arm, wrestled with the crumbling stone, claiming vast sections of the facade. A shiver, not entirely from the chill wind, traced its way down my spine. It wasn't just old, it felt tired. More than that, it felt full. I cut the engine. The sudden absence of the car's hum was deafening. The only sounds were the wind rustling through the overgrown foliage and the distant, mournful cry of a bird. I sat there for a long moment, just looking. My breath fogged the window. The sheer scale of the task ahead was staggering, a mountain of decay I was expected to climb. My usual methodical approach felt like a tiny chisel against a granite cliff. Stepping out, the air was heavy, damp, and smelled of wet earth, decaying leaves, and something vaguely metallic, like old pennies. The front door, a monstrous slab of oak adorned with tarnished brass, seemed to sag under its own weight. It looked more like a portal to another time than an entrance to a home. It carried the scent of mildew, dust, and something else, something cloying and sweet, like dried flowers mixed with rot. Dust motes danced in the sparse beams, illuminated like tiny, frantic spirits. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, painting fleeting patterns on the walls. A sweeping staircase, its banister carved with intricate, unsettling gargoyles, rose majestically into the upper floors, disappearing into the blackness. Tapestries, once vibrant, now hung in tattered shreds, their colors bleached to ghostly hues. Furniture, draped in white sheets, stood like silent, forgotten sentinels. Each sheet held the distinct outline of what lay beneath, a ghostly tableau of the past. I walked slowly, my footsteps muffled by layers of dust and fallen plaster. My hand instinctively reached out, brushing against a sheet-covered armchair. The fabric was rough, cool, and yielded a puff of fine, ancient dust that tickled my nose. This wasn't merely a house, it was a tomb, a time capsule sealed in neglect. My initial determination, the restorer's zeal to mend and preserve, was battling with a creeping unease. It felt less like I was alone and more like I was the only moving thing in a room full of dormant observers. I pushed deeper into the hall, my flashlight beam sweeping across the walls, revealing peeling wallpaper adorned with faded floral patterns. Behind a particularly large sheet-draped cabinet, a narrow, almost imperceptible seam in the wall caught my eye. It looked like a door, expertly disguised and painted over. My curiosity, the same impulse that drove me to meticulously reassemble shattered ceramics, tugged at me. I ran my fingers along the seam, feeling the subtle give of old wood beneath the layers of paint. With a soft grunt, I pushed. Inside, piled haphazardly, were stacks of old architectural drawings, rolled up and tied with brittle twine, alongside ledgers bound in decaying leather. I pulled one of the scrolls free, carefully unrolling it on the dusty floor. It was a hand-drawn plan, faded to sepia tones, detailing a section of the manor's original layout, or perhaps an older structure it was built upon. My eyes scanned the intricate lines, the careful notations, until a specific section, penned in a bolder, more aggressive hand, snagged my attention. A long, narrow chamber, devoid of windows, with a series of small, cell-like rooms branching off it. And scrawled above it, in stark, unsettling letters, was the label Old Death Row Corridor marked for closure. My breath hitched. The air in that small, hidden space felt suddenly impossibly heavy, pressing in on me. The metallic smell intensified, making my teeth ache. Why would such a thing be on the plans of a manor? Who would even conceive of such a place? I wasn't just restoring a house, I was uncovering something that felt utterly, profoundly wrong. The architect's drawing, spread across the dusty oak table, seemed to mock my meticulous nature. What kind of manor had such a feature? The metallic tang from that hidden space, imagined or real, still clung to the back of my throat, a phantom taste of rust and something else, something I couldn't quite place. I traced the line again with a trembling finger, the parchment cool beneath my touch, yet the image felt searing. My mind churned with questions, but no answers came, only the heavy, echoing silence of the manor. I needed to work. To focus on the tangible, the crumbling beauty waiting for my touch, rather than the unsettling whispers of the past. The drawing room, a vast space with soaring ceilings and windows overlooking neglected rose gardens, seemed like the logical place to start. Its grandeur, though faded, promised a satisfying challenge. I rolled up the plans, tucking them back into their heavy tube, and leaned them against the wall, trying to mentally seal away the disquiet they carried. The morning sun, filtered through grimy panes, cast long, dusty shafts across the room as I began. I set up my work table near a bay window, arranging my chisels, brushes, and solvents with the familiar precision that always calmed me. The scent of linseed oil and beeswax would soon replace the manor's pervasive damp earthiness. My first target, a heavy mahogany writing desk, its surface scarred by time and neglect, one of its ornate brass handles missing. A perfect, contained project to ease into the house's scale. I spent the first hour simply cleaning, wiping away decades of grime with soft cloths and specialized solutions. The rhythmic scrape of a fine wire brush against tarnished brass, the gentle hiss of solvent evaporating, these were the sounds I cherished, the symphony of restoration. It was when I reached for my smallest flathead screwdriver, intending to remove a stubborn, corroded screw from a drawer runner, that the first shift occurred. But it wasn't there. My fingers brushed the smooth desktop, then the rough linen cloth I'd laid down. Nothing. I frowned, a little annoyed at my own distraction. Perhaps I'd put it in the tool roll. I unrolled the canvas, checked each pocket. Empty. A sigh escaped me. I must have set it down somewhere else, though I couldn't imagine where. My tools had their place. I scanned the immediate area, then the floor around the desk. No screwdriver. I stood up, stretching my back, and walked around the desk, my eyes sweeping the room. Odd. I returned, a faint irritation prickling at me, and began to rummage through my kit for a spare. As I bent over, my elbow brushed against something on the other side of the desk, where I definitely hadn't been working. There it was, my flathead screwdriver, lying neatly on the polished surface of the desk's far side, precisely where I hadn't been within arm's reach. My brow furrowed. Had I walked around the desk and forgotten? Impossible. I never broke my focus like that. I shook my head, attributing it to fatigue, or the sheer strangeness of being alone in such a vast, silent place. I settled back into work, the incident nudging at the edges of my concentration. The rhythmic scraping resumed. Then, a distinct thump from the floor above. Not a creak of settling timbers, but a heavier, singular sound, like something falling. I froze, my hand hovering over the desk. I listened, holding my breath. The house seemed to hold its breath with me. Wind? A rat? I tried to rationalize it, but the sound had been too solid, too deliberate. It wasn't words, just a breathy rustle, like dry leaves skittering across stone. Only the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams, oblivious. A prickle started at the base of my skull, crawling up my scalp. I felt a sudden, intense sensation of being observed. Not just the general unease of a solitary figure in a large house, but a specific, focused gaze. I found myself pausing, my hands still, my tools forgotten, just listening. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was expectant, almost predatory. I decided to take a break, to clear my head. As I pushed back from the desk, my knee brushed against a small, almost invisible panel on the underside of the desk's side apron. I hadn't noticed it before. My restorer's instinct immediately took over. I knelt, examining the seam. A hidden compartment. My fingers probed the edges, searching for a catch, a release. After a moment, I found a tiny, almost imperceptible button, barely a pinprick, tucked into the curve of a carved rosette. I pressed it. My heart gave an involuntary lurch. Inside, nestled on a bed of ancient, crumbling felt, lay a single object. It was a small, heavy iron locket, tarnished almost black with age. It was smooth, unadorned, and closed tight. There was no clasp, no hinge visible. It felt like a solid, impenetrable piece of iron, yet clearly, it was meant to open. And it was exactly the same metallic, almost rusty, scent that had plagued me since I looked at the plans, a scent that now seemed to fill the air around me. I tried to pry it open, but it resisted, unyielding. The manor wasn't just old, it was watching. That grim, unmarked rectangle, labeled only as Old Death Row Corridor marked for closure, seemed to throb on the architect's drawing. It wasn't just the strange label that unsettled me, it was the way the line work around it felt heavier, almost etched deeper into the paper than the rest of the meticulous plans. What kind of manor had such a feature? My fingers traced the cold, dusty surface of the oak table, then the brittle edges of the blueprint. The sheer audacity of such a name in a residential building, no matter how grand or old, was a direct challenge to my orderly mind. I couldn't shake it. The image of that corridor, a phantom limb on the house's skeletal structure, kept pulling at my attention. The rest of the manor, for all its decay, followed a predictable, if sprawling, logic, but this? This was an anomaly, a scar. I folded the drawing carefully, the brittle paper groaning in protest, and tucked it into my satchel. My meticulous nature demanded answers, and my gut, a low, persistent hum of unease, insisted I find them. Armed with the drawing and a heavy-duty flashlight, I began my descent into the manor's lower levels. The air grew colder with each step, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic, like old pennies, but sharper, overlaid with the cloying sweetness of rot. My boots crunched on fallen plaster and splintered wood. Cobwebs, thick as shrouds, brushed against my face, and I swatted them away, feeling the gritty residue cling to my skin. I found myself in a low-ceilinged area, the stones rough-hewn and sweating. Here, the floor was uneven flagstone, slick with moisture. The air grew still, heavy, as if it had been trapped for centuries. No draft stirred down here, just a suffocating presence. My light scanned the wall. The drawing showed a seamless brick wall where the corridor should have been. But the architect's lines suggested it had existed. I ran my gloved hand over the damp stone, feeling for inconsistencies. But then, my fingers snagged on something smoother, a faint ridge. I swept the beam over it. A section of the wall, about 10 feet wide and 8 feet high, was covered in a thick layer of plaster, expertly blended to match the surrounding rough-hewn stone. It wasn't bricked up, it was sealed. This wasn't just a renovation. This was an obliteration. I retrieved a small hammer and a chisel from my toolkit. The first strike against the plaster sent a dull, muffled thud through the stagnant air. Dust, fine and ancient, puffed out, catching in the beam of my light. The smell intensified, that metallic tang sharper now, accompanied by a dry, musty scent that made my nose itch and my throat feel tight. I worked slowly, methodically, chipping away at the plaster. Each piece that fell revealed more of what lay beneath, not brick, but a solid, rough-hewn stone wall, sealed with mortar that looked almost like dried blood in the dim light. Hours blurred. My arms ached, and a fine film of dust coated every inch of me. I shone my light into the opening. It was indeed a corridor, narrow and low, disappearing into absolute blackness. The floor was packed earth, uneven and littered with debris. The walls were rough stone, glistening with moisture. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs, but my determination, or perhaps a morbid curiosity, pushed me forward. I squeezed through the opening, the rough stone scraping against my jacket. The air inside was dead, heavy, pressing in on me. I moved slowly, my boots disturbing nothing but the dust. The silence was absolute, broken only by the ragged sound of my own breathing. Then, in the furthest alcove, something glinted. I approached cautiously, my light steady. Tucked into a small, barely visible niche in the stone, almost perfectly camouflaged, was a small, leather-bound journal. Its cover was cracked and dry, the leather flaking away at the edges. I picked it up. It felt impossibly light, as if its contents had evaporated over time. My fingers, still gritty with dust, fumbled with the clasp. It opened with a soft creak. The pages inside were brittle, yellowed, filled with faded, spidery handwriting. I held it closer, my flashlight illuminating the first legible entry. August 14th. I find myself forgetting simple things. Names. Faces. The path to the garden. Siphoning them away? I turned a few more pages, the paper rustling like dry leaves. September 3rd. My own reflection seems alien. Who is that man staring back? I know his features, yes, but the light in his eyes. It's dimming. The erosion is undeniable. They spoke of it, the old ones. The manor consumes what it is given. The words were unsettling, vague yet terrifying. Erosion? Consumes? My mind struggled to process them, to fit them into any rational framework. I felt a sudden, sharp jolt of disorientation. What was I doing down here again? Why had I opened this wall? The journal felt heavy in my hand, its strange weight now a burden. I stared down at the page, rereading the last entry. The erosion is undeniable. I rubbed my temples. It was just the stress, the isolation, the sheer amount of dust I'd inhaled. My mind was playing tricks. My flashlight beam wavered. Had I left my chisel inside, or was it outside the opening? I couldn't quite remember. A faint, sickening tremor ran through me. Just tiredness, I told myself, pushing the thought away. The question felt like a pebble dropped into a vast, dark well, the ripples of confusion spreading through my mind. I shook my head, trying to dislodge the cobwebs forming in my thoughts. This manor was getting to me. The isolation, the constant dust, the sheer weight of its forgotten history pressing down. I needed answers, something concrete to anchor me, to explain away the creeping unease and the strange lapses in my memory. Logic, that was what I needed. I retreated from the unsettling opening, leaving the chisel's location a mystery for now. My focus shifted to the manor's library, a room I'd mostly neglected in favor of hands-on restoration. It was a chaotic archive of generations, crammed with leather-bound tomes, brittle ledgers, and stacks of yellowed newspapers. I spent the next few days immersed in its musty depths, my fingers stained with ancient dust and printer's ink. I sought any mention of the house, its previous owners, anything that might shed light on its peculiar atmosphere. The early records were sparse, detailing property transfers and minor renovations. But as I delved into the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a pattern began to emerge. Not explicit, not in bold headlines, but in the subtle omissions, the sudden gaps in family trees, the brief, almost apologetic mentions in local gazettes. One cryptic entry in a local parish register, dated 1888, noted the disappearance without trace of an entire family, the then occupants of this very house, with no further explanation. It felt less like a record and more like a carefully erased smudge. Another discovery sent a prickle of ice down my spine. Tucked away in a dusty box of architectural plans, I found a series of rough sketches, clearly not part of the original blueprints. The drawings were crude, almost frantic, detailing a long, narrow passage with thick, reinforced doors. My breath hitched. Death row? In a manor house? The thought was absurd, yet the sketches were undeniably real, and the desperation in the handwriting palpable. Was this some old, forgotten dungeon? A holding area for criminals before local justice was meted out? The very idea was grotesque. That night, the dreams started. Not vague anxieties, but sharp, vivid assaults on my subconscious. Figures, indistinct and faceless, moved in the periphery, their movements fluid and unnatural. They didn't speak, but their presence communicated a profound, ancient hunger. I woke up gasping, the taste of dust in my mouth, the phantom echo of a distant, mournful wail still ringing in my ears. My sheets were tangled, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The dreams bled into my waking hours. I'd be sanding a piece of mahogany, the rhythmic rasp of sandpaper a familiar comfort, when the wood grain would suddenly ripple, twisting into grotesque, leering faces before snapping back to normal. The memory gaps grew wider, more alarming. I'd set out to retrieve a specific tool, only to find myself standing in a different room, tool in hand, with no recollection of how I'd gotten there or what I'd originally intended to do. One afternoon, I stared at a half-finished restoration project, a delicate porcelain figurine, and for a terrifying moment, I couldn't remember what it was, or why it was important to me. The intricate details, the hours of careful work, all of it felt alien, like someone else's endeavor. I found myself muttering aloud, trying to retrace my steps, to reconstruct the shattered fragments of my day. "Read," I'd say, my voice sounding thin and reedy in the cavernous rooms. "My name is Reed. I'm an antique restorer." The phrase haunted me, intertwining with the growing certainty that something malevolent resided here, something that fed on more than just the dust and decay. It fed on me. It was slowly, methodically, dismantling my mind, brick by brick, memory by memory. And I was beginning to forget what those bricks even looked like. I couldn't quite grasp it. A prickle of unease snaked up my spine. This wasn't just forgetfulness, it was a sudden, jarring blankness where a clear memory should have been. The corridor stretched ahead, a narrow tunnel of crumbling plaster and warped floorboards. This wasn't the section of the manor I'd been working on. This was new, a passage I'd only just uncovered behind a false wall in the servants' quarters. It led deeper, further down, into what felt like the very foundations of the house. I hesitated, the sensible part of me screaming to retreat, to mark this off and explore it properly later. But a strange compulsion, a tug of morbid curiosity, pulled me forward. The chisel, I told myself. I just needed to find the chisel. My light struggled against the immensity of the black. I swung the beam around, and the light caught on something stark and unsettling. A heavy, iron-barred door, rusted solid. My stomach dropped. This wasn't part of any architectural plan I'd seen, nor any historical record. These weren't cell doors from a prison. They were too crude, too ancient, yet undeniably designed to contain. My mind reeled. A manor house, yes, but this? Heavier. My gaze traced the length of the corridor, the rows of silent, menacing doors. The air thrummed with a low, almost imperceptible hum, like a distant, forgotten engine. Or was it just the blood rushing in my ears? My own hand looked alien in the flashlight's beam, the lines on my palm suddenly unfamiliar. It wasn't words, not exactly, but a suggestion of them, a faint, insistent murmur that seemed to coil around my thoughts. Who? A flicker at the end of the corridor. My beam shot towards it. Nothing. But I'd seen something. Then, a new sound. A rhythmic, metallic clink. 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 It was faint, echoing, as if coming from behind one of the sealed doors. My heart hammered, a frantic drum against my ribs. It sounded like a tool. My chisel. Driven by a desperate, illogical hope, I started walking, my steps tentative. The clinking grew louder, more distinct. It was coming from the third door on the left. I reached it, the iron bars thick with rust, the small, grated window choked with cobwebs and dirt. I pressed my ear to the cold metal. The clinking stopped. Instead, I heard breathing. Slow, ragged, impossibly close. And then, a voice. My voice. Read, it rasped from inside the cell, muffled but undeniably my own tone, my inflection. You left me here. My blood turned to slush in my veins. My own name, spoken by my own voice, from inside a barred cell in this nightmare corridor. I stumbled back, shining the light frantically at the door. No reflection. No mirror. Just the impenetrable gloom behind the bars. What? What is this? My voice trembled, alien even to my own ears. You remember. You just forgot where you put it. The chisel. The forgotten chisel. The memory of putting it away, of needing it, of losing it, all tangled into a knot of impossible confusion. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to clear the fog. This wasn't real. This was the house, the entity, playing tricks. It was trying to unravel me. I opened my eyes. The corridor was gone. I was standing in my workshop, the familiar scent of linseed oil and sawdust filling the air. My workbench was before me, neat and orderly. My chisel lay precisely in its designated slot in the tool roll. A half-finished mahogany desk sat on the trestles, awaiting its final polish. The afternoon sun streamed through the window, warm and reassuring. A wave of relief so profound it nearly buckled my knees washed over me. It was a dream. A vivid, terrifying dream. I must have drifted off. I reached for the chisel, my fingers brushing the cool steel. It was real. Solid. My tool. Then, a faint, metallic clink echoed from the corner of the workshop. My head snapped up. The mahogany desk was no longer there. In its place stood a heavy, iron-barred door, rusted solid. You forget so much, don't you? Like who you are. They was I in the corridor? They was I in the workshop? They was this my memory, or a fabricated one? The lines between what I knew, what I saw, and what I felt were blurring, dissolving into a terrifying, indistinct haze. I looked down at my hands, my familiar hands. Were they truly mine? And the chisel, still clutched in my trembling fingers, had I always held it? Or had I just picked it up, a moment ago, in a place that no longer existed? It was feeding. And I was dissolving. The W hung in the air, a phantom letter. It was? Went. Wavered? I had to get out. This wasn't just a strange house, it was a hungry maw. I turned, stumbling, the floorboards groaning underfoot as if in protest, or perhaps agreement. My goal was simple, the front door. Or any door that led out. I remembered the grand entrance, the heavy oak, the tarnished brass knocker shaped like a grimacing gargoyle. But the corridor, which I was certain led directly there, seemed to stretch, twist, and deepen with every step. The wallpaper, a faded floral pattern I had intended to strip, now seemed to writhe with indistinct shapes, like faces trapped just beneath the surface, pressing outwards. My hand went to my pocket, searching for my phone. It wasn't there. Panic, cold and sharp, pricked at me. Had I left it in the workshop, or had I even brought it in today? The thought was a dull ache behind my eyes. I retraced my steps, or thought I did, back towards where I thought the workshop was. The light, already dim, seemed to be swallowed by the walls. My fingers brushed against something, a seam, a faint outline. This wasn't a utility passage. This felt wrong. Deeply, fundamentally wrong. Logic screamed at me to turn back, to find the main hall, to just leave. This might be a way out, a forgotten exit. Or perhaps, a way to understand what was happening to me. The passage was narrow, forcing me to hunch. The floor was uneven flagstone, slick with an unidentifiable moisture. My boots squelched. I reached out, my hand searching for a switch, a pull chain, anything. There was nothing. Then, a faint, sickly green glow emanated from further within. It pulsed, slow and rhythmic, like a dying heart. I moved towards it, drawn by its unnatural light, each step echoing unnaturally in the confined space. The passage opened into a wider area, a long, low-ceiling chamber. It wasn't a metaphor. It was real, or felt real. The walls were rough-hewn stone, streaked with what looked like dried grime, or worse. This place didn't belong in the manor. It was an anachronism, a nightmare made stone. Yet, here it was. My mind reeled. Had the previous owner built this? Why, for what purpose? I moved closer to the bars, peering into one of the cells. The green light pulsed, revealing nothing but bare stone walls and a single, rusted ring bolted into the floor. No bed, no toilet, just the ring. This wasn't just a place of confinement, it was a place of utter, absolute abandonment. Then I saw it. Hundreds of them. And beneath them, a single word, carved deep and raw, gone. My breath hitched. Gone. Not dead, not escaped. Gone. It didn't just kill, it erased. It consumed. It made you gone. And this corridor, this horrifying relic, was a testament to its long, terrible history within these walls. My determination, which had been a flickering ember, now roared into a desperate fire. This place was a tomb, and I was being prepared for burial. I turned, scrambling back towards the narrow passage, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. Forget the phone. Forget understanding. I ran, not caring where I was going, just away from that green light, away from those bars, away from the word gone. I rounded a corner, then another, the layout of the manor twisting and turning, no longer making any sense. Had I taken a wrong turn? Was this a different corridor entirely? The walls seemed to shift, the doors multiplying, each one identical, mocking me. I pounded on one, then another, my knuckles aching. Locked. I was alone. Utterly, terrifyingly alone. The entity wasn't just eroding my mind, it was sealing me within its own, vast, decaying labyrinth. The manor's silence was a living thing, thick and suffocating. It pressed in, not with the absence of sound, but with the quiet hum of something vast and ancient, always listening. The wind outside whispered through the broken Glass of the conservatory, a mournful, drawn-out sigh that seemed to carry the names of things I was forgetting. My hands, once so sure with a delicate brush, now trembled with a persistent, cold tremor. The outside world wasn't just unreachable, it was a half-remembered dream, a faded photograph whose edges were curling into ash. But even as the tendrils of oblivion crept closer, a stubborn ember of defiance flickered within me. I refused to let it take everything without a fight, without understanding. The entity wasn't just consuming, it was here, within these walls, a parasite that had burrowed deep into the very stone and timber. If it existed, it had a history. If it had a history, there had to be a record. My mind, a sieve losing its contents, still clung to a singular, desperate thread, the recurring, half-glimpsed image of a particular symbol, etched into the spine of a book I'd seen in the manor's neglected library, or perhaps in the faded wallpaper of a locked room. It was a spiral, not elegant, but jagged, almost like a scar. I needed to find where that symbol led. My search led me deeper, away from the grand reception rooms and toward the forgotten service wings, an older section of the house I hadn't truly explored. The floorboards groaned beneath my weight, complaining with the weariness of ages. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light that pierced the grimy windows, looking like miniature galaxies in slow, agonizing collapse. The air grew stale, carrying the metallic tang of old rust and the cloying sweetness of decay, like forgotten flowers left to rot in a closed casket. I pushed open a heavy, unpainted door, its hinges screaming in protest. Beyond lay a narrow, low-ceilinged passage, the kind designed for staff, not for the manor's gentry. The walls here were rough-hewn stone, damp and slick to the touch, and the path sloped downwards, deeper into the earth. Then, I saw it. A faint, almost imperceptible glow emanating from a crack in the wall ahead. This wasn't a cellar or a pantry. This was it. The place I had seen in fragmented visions, the place that had haunted the periphery of my fading consciousness. The doors, I realized with a jolt of horror, were cells. Not for criminals, not in the traditional sense, but for something else. Something taken. My eyes scanned the grim expanse, drawn to the far end. There, on a table cobbled together from old crates, sat a stack of ancient, leather-bound ledgers and loose, brittle pages covered in frantic, spidery script. This was the record. The language was archaic, the handwriting almost illegible in places, but the recurring symbols, the jagged spiral, and the desperate tone of the entries spoke volumes. I pieced it together, fragments of a horrific mosaic snapping into place. The entity had no name, not one that could be spoken. It was simply the hunger. It had existed for millennia, a primordial echo from a time before memory itself, drawn to places of profound human suffering, grief, and especially, forgetting. It didn't kill with violence, it killed with erasure. It fed on memory, on identity. It consumed the very essence of what made a person them. The corridor, I now understood, wasn't a prison for bodies, but for minds. The previous inhabitants of the manor, those who had succumbed to its slow, insidious drain, had been brought here. Not to die, but to be processed. Their fading memories, their dissolving identities, were harvested in this desolate place. The victims, reduced to empty vessels, their minds scoured clean, were then discarded. This was what was happening to me. It was the hunger, meticulously dissecting my mind, plucking away each precious thread of who I was. And then I found the last, most horrifying entry, scrawled in a hand that looked almost identical to my own, only more desperate, more broken. It spoke of appeasement, of a temporary reprieve. The hunger could be satiated, but only for a time, and only with the most profound sacrifice, a willing offering of a core memory, a fundamental piece of one's identity, freely given. Not just any memory, but the defining memory, the one that anchored everything else. To give it up was not to die, but to become someone else entirely, a stranger in one's own skin, a ghost in one's own life, serving as an empty vessel to hold the entity at bay. The true cost, the ultimate sacrifice, wasn't my life. It was myself. My unique history, my love for restoration, my quirks, my fears, my very name. I could feel the entity's presence intensify, a cold breath on the back of my neck, a soft, seductive whisper in the depths of my failing mind, urging me to just let go. The truth was revealed, stark and horrifying. The entity fed on identity, and it demanded mine, piece by agonizing piece. And to stop it, to even pause its relentless consumption, I would have to willingly offer the most precious, most irreplaceable part of my soul. I stood there, utterly alone, the weight of that impossible choice settling over me like a tombstone. I stood in the vast, echoing library, the remnants of my research scattered across a dust-laden table. Or was it the dining room? Who was I, truly? The memories were like sand, slipping through my fingers, each grain a name, a face, a cherished moment, gone. It was like living with a slow, internal bleed. But amidst the terrifying erosion, a stubborn core remained. A spark of defiance. I knew what was happening. I knew it was happening. And if I was to be erased, I would not go quietly. Not without a fight. Not without taking it with me, if I could. The manor held it, I was sure of that. I'd seen it in the old blueprints, half erased, dismissed as a structural anomaly, a forgotten sublevel. But the truth was far more sinister. I pushed aside a heavy, warped tapestry, revealing not a wall, but a narrow, descending stairwell, long bricked over and forgotten. This was it. The air here was dead, motionless, thick with the weight of untold centuries. They spiraled down, down, into the very foundations of the manor, past layers of brick and mortar that spoke of countless alterations, endless attempts to bury what lay beneath. My light swept across the rough-hewn stone walls, revealing a series of identical, heavy wooden doors, each studded with rusted iron. This was no cellar. This was no ordinary dungeon. I knew it with a certainty that transcended mere memory. This was where hope died, where identities were stripped away, not just by sentence, but by the crushing weight of impending oblivion. A perfect pantry for the entity. My breath hitched in my throat, not from fear, but from the horrifying realization that clicked into place. This wasn't just a place it fed. This was a place it had helped create. This corridor, these cells, were designed to produce the very essence it craved. It had shaped the manor's history, guided its inhabitants to build this monument to despair. The plan, once a nebulous idea, solidified into brutal clarity. I would enter the corridor. I would offer myself, not as a meal, but as a lure. My fading memories, my dissolving identity, all of it would be the bait. I would draw the entity into this place, its most potent feeding ground, and then I would seal it. Seal it away, not just from the manor, but from the world. The sacrifice was immense. I knew that. To seal the entity, I would have to become a part of the seal. My remaining self, my last vestiges of who Reed was, would be bound to this place, a permanent anchor. I would be consumed, yes, but not by its will, not by its slow, insidious theft. I would offer myself, a deliberate act of self-immolation. I would become a ghost in its prison, a memory that would forever haunt it, rather than being one of its forgotten victims. My fingers brushed against the rough stone of a cell door. The wood was splintered, ancient, yet it felt strangely resilient. A faint, almost imperceptible hum resonated from within. The entity was here, or its presence was strongest here. It was waiting. A profound sadness washed over me, a grief for the life I'd lived, the person I'd been. The future that would never be. This was my last act. My final restoration. Not of an antique, but of a world I might never remember. I took a deep, shuddering breath, the metallic tang of the corridor filling my lungs. It was time. But I couldn't let it touch me. Not now. My breath hitched, a ragged sound in the cavernous space. My hands, usually steady and precise, trembled as I clutched the heavy, iron-bound ledger. It wasn't the book itself, but what it represented, the meticulous records, the forgotten names, the truths painstakingly documented by a long-dead chronicler of this house. It was an anchor, a tether to concrete fact, and my only weapon against the encroaching tide of oblivion. My plan was simple, desperately so: confront the entity at its perceived heart, the place where the manor's cruelest memories had congealed, and assert my own existence with an undeniable, documented truth. I moved through the grand hall, the air growing colder with each step. Dust motes danced in the slivers of moonlight piercing the grimy windows, like phantom snow. Every floorboard creaked a protest under my weight, a chorus of dissent that felt less like old wood and more like 1,000 forgotten voices. I pushed open a heavy, unvarnished door I'd only recently discovered, tucked away behind a false panel in the servants' quarters. The hinges shrieked, a sound like tearing fabric, and then I was in a narrow, descending passage. My flashlight beam cut through the absolute black, revealing walls of rough-hewn stone, sweating with ancient moisture. The descent felt endless, each step taking me further from the world I knew, deeper into the manor's festering core. It was a hungry mouth, opening wider with every inch I descended. My light swept across the peeling paint of a low ceiling, the grimy, institutional green of the walls. There were heavy, bolted doors lining one side, each with a small, grid window, like eyes staring out from a forgotten past. This was it. The air here was thick, heavy with the weight of despair. The entity was here, stronger, more voracious. My name is Reed. And then it began. They weren't words, not exactly, but fragments of sound, echoes of laughter, cries, hurried conversations. They were memories, not mine, but belonging to the countless others who had passed through this place, now weaponized, aimed at me. A sudden, sharp image flashed in my mind, not the corridor, but my old workshop, bathed in the golden glow of a desk lamp. I was hunched over a delicate porcelain doll, my fingers painstakingly mending a hairline crack. My hands, in the vision, were not my own, they were gnarled, ancient, covered in unfamiliar scars. No, I rasped, clutching the ledger tighter. That's not me. I am Reed. I restore. I mend. The pressure intensified. My own memories started to fray at the edges. I saw my mother's face, but her eyes were empty, her smile a rictus of despair. The entity wasn't just showing me false memories, it was eating the real ones, replacing them with its own poison, I fell to my knees, the heavy ledger clattering against the cold stone floor. A wave of profound disorientation washed over me. Who was I? Reed? Was that even my name? A memory, sharp and vivid, pierced through the fog, the first time I held a delicate, broken music box, the thrill of understanding its intricate mechanics, the patience required to make it whole again. The feeling of purpose, of being Reed, the restorer. I clung to it, a drowning man to a spar. I remember. I fix. I am. Reed. The entity recoiled, a perceptible shiver through the very air, a momentary lessening of the crushing pressure. It hated the assertion of self, the anchor of identity. I scrambled, my trembling fingers fumbling with the clasp of the ledger. I had to fight not just for my life, but for the very concept of Reed to exist. The air tasted like dust and damp concrete, heavy and still. My eyes fluttered open, gritty and slow, as if they'd been glued shut for a week. A dull ache throbbed behind my temples, a persistent hum that echoed the profound silence around me. The crushing weight, the suffocating presence that had held me captive just moments ago, was gone. Vanished. It left behind only this strange, hollow quiet. Slowly, I pushed myself up, my muscles screaming in protest. When I finally managed to sit upright, my gaze swept across my surroundings. This wasn't the library. This wasn't any part of the manor I recognized. The space was long, narrow, and claustrophobic. High above, faint slivers of light filtered through grimy, barred windows set too high to see out of, casting weak, dusty shafts onto peeling gray walls. They were all identical, stark, and terribly final. The air carried a faint, unsettling scent of rust and decay, something stale and forgotten. A rusty plaque, half obscured by years of neglect, caught my eye. Death row? Closure? My mind snagged on the words, trying to make sense of them. What did they mean? Why was I here? My fingers, still trembling, instinctively clutched at something in my lap. The ledger. It was still there, its leather cover worn smooth beneath my touch. Had I opened it? Had I spoken the names? A faint echo, like distant church bells heard through heavy fog, whispered in my memory. Names. Truths. A release. The entity had recoiled. I remembered that much. A shiver in the air, a lessening of pressure. A victory, then? I tried to stand, my legs wobbling like a newborn fawn's. The corridor stretched out, seemingly endless, each door a silent sentinel to what? To whom? I took a tentative step, then another, my boots scuffing softly on the concrete. The silence was absolute, broken only by my ragged breathing. It felt like I was walking through a forgotten tomb, or perhaps, a museum of lost selves. Reed, I mumbled, testing the name. It felt familiar. Correct. But the certainty wasn't there. It was like recalling a fact from a book I'd skimmed, not a fundamental truth of my own being. A blur. My profession. An antique restorer. I could see the tools, feel the wood grain beneath my fingers, smell the linseed oil, but the why of it, the passion, the specific projects. They were ghosts. I stopped, leaning heavily against one of the metal doors. I tried to recall my parents. Their faces. Their names.
Nothing. My childhood home? A vague sense of warmth, but no specific memory, no detail to anchor it. The horror wasn't the entity anymore.
The entity was gone, or at least, dormant. The horror was what it had left behind. I had fought for my identity, I had asserted myself, and I had won. But the victory felt like a surgical amputation. The thing had taken its pound of flesh, not literally, but something far more precious. It had carved out the very core of what made me, me. I looked down at my hands, the hands that had carefully restored countless forgotten treasures. They still looked like my hands, calloused and long-fingered. But the memories of those restorations, the painstaking hours, the triumphs, the small failures, they were gone. Replaced by a vast, terrifying emptiness. The marked for closure sign wasn't just for this forgotten wing. It was for me. My past, my future, my very essence had been processed, deemed irreparable, and filed away. I was free. But I was also a stranger, adrift in a world where the most intimate landscapes, my own memories, were alien territory. The entity had receded, but its scars were not merely lingering, they were woven into the very fabric of my being, an irreversible erosion that left me profoundly, terrifyingly alone. Dot had vanished. It was gone. My breath hitched, a dry, rasping sound in the profound silence. The air still tasted of dust and damp concrete, but the crushing weight was truly absent. I pushed myself up, my limbs screaming in protest, each joint a rusty hinge. The space around me was dim, lit by a single, flickering bulb far down a long, narrow hall. My mind, still a jumble of fractured images and phantom sensations, struggled to reconcile the impossible. Had I been here all along? Was this the final trap? But then I saw it, a gaping hole in the concrete wall beside me, jagged rebar reaching out like skeletal fingers. Beyond it, not stone, but loose earth, roots, and then a faint, true glimmer of daylight filtering through a distant crack. The entity, whatever it was, had been tethered to this place, to the very stones of the manor. And I had broken free. I must have. The relief that washed over me was a physical wave, leaving me weak but resolute. I crawled, then stumbled, out of that suffocating space, towards the promise of the sun. The journey away from the manor was a blur. I recall vague snippets, the burning smell of damp earth, the chill of morning air on my skin, the bewildered faces of a few locals who found me wandering the overgrown lane, covered in grime and babbling about forgotten passages. They must have thought I was mad. Perhaps I was. But I was free. The manor, I learned later, had been condemned, its structural integrity compromised beyond repair by the very passages I'd unearthed. A small mercy, I thought. Let it crumble. Let the entity starve. I didn't look back. I sold what few possessions I still owned, left the country, and settled in a quiet coastal town thousands of miles away. The salty air and the constant murmur of the waves were a balm to my frayed nerves. I wanted simple, clean lines. Functional beauty. I yearned for the familiar comfort of mahogany dust and the gentle sheen of polished brass. My hands, still scarred and trembling at times, craved the precise work of restoration. For months, I worked. I meticulously repaired a chipped porcelain figurine, brought a tarnished silver locket back to its former brilliance, breathed new life into a neglected grandfather clock. Each piece was an anchor, a testament to tangible reality,
to the quiet satisfaction of making something whole again.
I focused on the present, on the delicate curve of a teacup handle, the intricate inlay of a writing desk. I told myself the entity was gone, banished, locked away in the crumbling ruins of that accursed house.
I had won. I had survived.
Sometimes, while sanding a smooth piece of oak, my mind would drift, and I'd find myself meticulously carving a pattern that wasn't there in the original, a swirling, organic motif that echoed the parasitic growth I'd seen in the manor's hidden chambers.
I'd catch myself humming a forgotten tune, a discordant melody that felt ancient and wrong.
My memories, once so sharp and precise, began to feel like a poorly restored painting, vibrant in places, but with entire sections faded, warped, or outright missing. I'd try to recall a specific conversation with a colleague from years ago, only to find myself grasping at smoke, the details dissolving into a general sense of unease.
Conversely, new memories, vivid and unsettling, would sometimes surface.
Memories of places I'd never been, people I'd never met, events that felt profoundly mine, yet utterly alien. One afternoon, I was carefully reattaching a delicate finial to an antique music box. The piece was intricate, requiring absolute focus. As I held it, my fingers felt unusually long, slender, almost skeletal. I looked down, startled. They were my hands, of course, but for a fleeting moment, they seemed to possess an unnatural grace, a strange, alien precision. I felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to not restore the music box.
To let it remain broken.
To feel the rough edges, the missing pieces.
To embrace the decay. I dropped the finial with a clatter.
That night, alone in my workshop, the ocean's murmur seemed to shift, to take on the rhythm of distant, echoing footsteps. There was a presence, a quiet hum that resonated with my own heartbeat.
It wasn't menacing, not exactly. It was familiar.
It was part of me now.
The entity hadn't been trapped in the manor.
It had merely found a new vessel, a new home. It didn't feed on my memories, it became my memories.
It didn't erode my identity, it was asterisk my identity, subtly rewoven, expanded, made something grander and far more ancient than I could comprehend. My victory was nothing more than its ultimate assimilation.
I was no longer Reed, the meticulous antique restorer.
And the most terrifying part?
A part of me, a deep, unsettling part, found a perverse comfort in it.